Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. I am very, very happy and very thrilled to bring you the conversation I had with Greg Grandin. Greg is historian and professor of history at Yale University. He has his bachelor's from Brooklyn College and PhD from Yale University. He's been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences since 2010, and he is an expert on Latin American politics, the Cold War, and U.S. foreign policy. He is the author of numerous books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning The End of the Myth. And he's back with his latest book, América, and we talk all about it. I was very excited for this conversation, mostly because I have family myself all up and down the Americas, family in North, Central, and South America. So I am very much American. And I really was curious to see a new history of the Americas, and Greg just knocked it out of the park. He did a fantastic job with the book. It's one of my favorites this year, to be honest. And he was exceptional in conversation as well. We discuss the term American, where that comes from, and how it's become associated with the United States. Although it's interesting that it is we are all Americans in North, Central, South America. We talk about the landscape of the Americas, pre-colonial years. We talk about Spanish colonialism, British colonialism, and the American and French revolutions and how they were very important. Talking about Bolívar. We talk about Gran Colombia, the Monroe Doctrine, FDR's New Deal in Latin America, the future of America, and many other topics. I have to say, we spend much of the conversation in the beginning of sort of the Americas, kind of a little bit pre-colonial, but definitely Spanish, British colonialism. We talk a lot about that. We talk about Gran Colombia, of course, a little bit of Monroe Doctrine, but we spent a lot of time in the early part, I think, because the formation of things was really, really interesting. We do towards the end talk a little bit about FDR and how the New Deal was in Latin America, but less so. And there were, his book is 700 plus pages. It's incredible. It's very, very vast. It's great. So there was no way we could have covered everything. So I highly encourage folks getting the book. But very, very proud of our conversation. And again, he was just exceptional. So you can find this conversation and all other conversations at Converging Dialogues at Substack.com, also on YouTube. So get over there, subscribe on the Substack. That really, really helps. Always love seeing those subscriptions. And share with your friends widely, and plenty of other conversations on this topic on the podcast. So, and now I bring you Greg Grandin. I am here with Greg Grandin. Greg, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I am greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks for having me. I am too.
Yeah, you've written a new masterpiece. This is the book I'm going to recommend to anyone if they want to know the history of the Western Hemisphere. The book is called América, A New History of the New World. This is out through Penguin Press, and it's a magnum opus in my mind. It is very good. It is very, very good to have all of our history in one place. So of course it's 700 pages, but I think it's maybe too short. So there's so much rich history on this part of the world. So so we'll talk all about it. Before we do, just tell listeners kind of your potted snapshot of yourself, academically, professionally, and anything else.
Well, I teach history at Yale University. I mostly started out working out as a Latin Americanist and I wrote a few books on Guatemala and political violence in Guatemala, and I was always interested in larger U.S. Latin American relations. And then, I guess the progression goes something like you can't look at any one country in Latin America without looking at other countries in Latin America without looking at the United States' relations with Latin America, but then you can't look at United States' relations without Latin America without also looking at the world and U.S. history. So I've written a few different eclectic books. I wrote a book about Fordlandia, Henry Ford's attempt to build a model city in the middle of the Amazon. That didn't go well. I wrote a book on Henry Kissinger, Kissinger's shadow. That didn't go well either. Kissinger's time as National Security Advisor. I wrote another book on Herman Melville's engagement with slavery and the Empire of Necessity, the true story behind a short story that he wrote called Benito Sereno. And I guess most recently, I wrote a book, The End of the Myth, to try to explain Donald Trump and from the frontier to the border wall in the mind of America. And that won a Pulitzer Prize.
I was going to say, we should mention you did get your flowers for that.
I was going to mention.
Yeah. You got your flowers. You got that Pulitzer. Good for you. Good for you. Good for you. So that's great. Yeah, I mean that's great. I think. Do you like, you still? I mean, you're doing kind of teaching and writing, which I'm sure complements each other. But do you feel like you do one more than the other now, or you do more writing, or are you still really active teaching? As well.
No, I'm still active. I still teach at Yale, regular. But tenured position at Yale. I teach 2 classes a semester, and
that's great.
Teach undergraduates, graduate students. Yeah,
that's great.
And then I try to write.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So so for this one, it's a big book. It's very sweeping. You kind of basically start in colonial period and get us all the way up to, I mean, really,
Gaza.
You kind of go really current. I would say 70s, 80s is where, last chapters are kind of there, but it kind of goes all the way up to present. So, so let's not spend too much time on this, but this term America and an American, I'm not one of those folks that kind of corrects people on it, but most of the time people say, Americans, they think of people from the United States, but me and other folks have, said, well, actually, we're all Americans, right? It is North, Central, South America. You mentioned, I think, in the beginning of the book, why do you think, I mean, there's some probably, smaller history here to this, but why do you think the U.S. is taking the possessive on Americans and we're Americans, and we kind of exclude, intentionally or not, that everyone else is American as well? I mean, why do you think that's the case when we talk about Americans?
Well, it is a word that was contested quite early. Why is it the case? The United States. What's funny about it, of course, is that people start teaching colonial history. They start with the British, even though the Spanish had colonized South America and the Caribbean 100 years, more than 100 years before Jamestown and Plymouth Bay. My daughter's in the 7th grade, and then she's learning all about Plymouth critically. She goes to a progressive school, so they're learning critically about colonialism. But they start with Plymouth Bay. They don't start with the Spanish conquest, which happened 100 years prior. So America was a term that was not immediately used to describe the New World. It was the Indies. And other things, the Antilles, and other names that were used to describe the New World, but eventually America or the Indies became kind of interchangeable. Now, the United States, what becomes the United States, British colonials, they start calling themselves American too. Cotton Mather might have been the very first person to say, "I that am an American." Actually, it sounded quite a lot like Jeff Bezos letter yesterday, where he said, "I am of and in America," whatever that line was. I mean, it was very close to Cotton Mather, and Mather is considered one of the first expressions of U.S. nationalism. The idea that he is not British, he's not, he's an American, but Latin Americans also, what becomes Latin America, would call themselves Americans too. There was a shared sense of America. Not so much a contest, because I don't think there was a lot of exchange on that level. But certainly the United States, almost immediately with its revolution, both use the word America to describe themselves and did this as they were, the 13 colonies on the eastern part of the Appalachia, and what they would become, all of the Americas. That tension, the rest of the continent. And then there was the unfortunate problem that there were these Spanish speakers in the South, in Mexico, and in South America. But when U.S. speakers used the word America, they tended to mean the United States of America and the America that they would become, with the idea of getting to the Pacific. Now, eventually, that does come into conflict with Latin America, and there's a number of different points of conflict. At first, Latin Americans, Spanish American revolutionaries, Republicans, sharing a sense of kind of fraternal republicanism, would identify themselves as, would call the United States the Republic of the North, or the United States of the North, Del Norte. And they didn't do it in a way that meant to disparage the United States, because Mexico was the United States of Mexico. And Argentina was the United Provinces of also. So there was this sense of that we were all Americans. But increasingly, the United States became very proprietary about the name, and it really was the U.S. who first politicized the name and took umbrage that other countries of the United States of the New World presumed to call themselves America. The very first kind of instance of this was Mexican president gave a speech that was a little annoyed that the United States wasn't living up to the pledge of the Monroe Doctrine, and threatening, as Spain seemed to be preparing to try to reconquer Mexico. This was around 1829, and he called the United States Los Estados Unidos del Norte. And the U.S. ambassador to Spain, Alexander Hill, took great umbrage at this. He's like, well, first they stole half our name by calling themselves the Estados Unidos de Mexico, and then they denying to use our real name, which is America. So right away there was a kind of politicization name. Then later on, as the United States really turns into where the reality meets the potential, and the United States moves west like a whirligig with a tremendous amount of energy and kinetic energy in terms of displacing Native Americans and Mexicans off of the continent. The idea that there were two Americans emerges from Latin America, that there was a rapacious Anglo-America, a Saxon America that was materialistic, utilitarian, conquering, and a Latin America that was diaphanous, that was spiritual, that was humanist, and that these two Americas, that the Spanish America or the Latin America had to contain the United States, the Saxon America.
Oh, wow, that's again, I like how you explain that, because it gives a lot more context, I think, for myself and hopefully for listeners, of like, okay, like there's some history behind how we call ourselves this, and that it's not a great history all the time. So
yeah, we don't want to spend too much time on this, but I will say that there's a lot of history about this. But Latin Americans they adopt the term Latin specifically in protest to William Walker's conquest of Nicaragua in the 1850s. This was a filibuster expedition that reimposed slavery on a country that had abolished slavery. William Walker declares himself president and starts making deals with southern states to turn Nicaragua into a southern slave state. And it's at that moment that what up until times had been called Spanish Americans or South Americans or Central Americans began to adopt the phrase Latin America. And one more quick thing on this is that it's not just a preoccupation of elites. The Los Tigres del Norte, a norteño band, widely popular with migrant communities in northern Mexico and southern United States. They have a great song somos más americano. We are more American than the Anglo-Saxons. So that politicization it has deep roots and long-lasting roots.
Yeah. So we should start with the Spanish, colonization and conquest and things like that. Before that, just kind of as a kind of a prelude to that, just kind of give us the landscape of, again, it's very, diverse and large, but there were obviously indigenous peoples, native peoples up and down the Western Hemisphere in Canada, North America, Mexico, Central South America, in the Caribbean. Yeah, what were the Spanish kind of walking into, right? As best we know, pre-colonial times, again, it starts to get tough to know, in terms of documentation, history, but what do we know about how many people were here, aspects of the inhabitants? Again, very vast, but general overtures here.
Yeah, well, there was quite a bit of diversity across the whole of the New World. Demographers estimate, they can't be sure, that maybe 100 million people lived in the New World at the time of the arrival of Columbus. We have to have a date, 1492, and there was great diversity in cultures and languages, in customs and economies. Of course, there was the three great sedentary empires: the Inca in the Andes, the for lack of a better word, Aztecs in the central Mexican Valley, and the Maya in what is now Guatemala, southern Mexico, and El Salvador. And then there were the kind of more less imperialistic. Those are three great civilizations: imperialistic, hierarchical, scientific. And there's the more pastoral kind of Taino who populated the Caribbean.
Yeah.
The islands of the Caribbean, and there was much diversity among those people also, and of course, people are more familiar with Native Americans in North America. So the Spanish arrive in 1492, and really for the first couple of decades, it's all about the Caribbean and the Greater Caribbean, and going further and further out, and it's all centered in Hispaniola, the island that is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And it's about establishing colonial control there, and then expanding the radius. And the expansion of the radius had to do with both the pacification of indigenous peoples on other islands and on coastal Caribbean, what's now Venezuela, Colombia, Central America, Mexico, but also labor demands as the population falls off through violence, through brutality, and through epidemics. So I will just throw this out here now early in the conversation. Demographers don't know exactly the number of people that lived in the New World. They estimate about 100 million, but they're pretty confident that the die-off by the end of the 1600s was 90% of that. That by 1600 there were maybe 10 million Native Americans alive, and the Caribbean was devastated probably to a greater extent. But that number 90% also holds to when the English arrive in what's now New England. Cotton Mather estimated that 90% that disease killed about 90% disease and war.
Yeah. So a few things here. I mean, I'll just say this. I mean, I'm curious. I mean, you obviously talk about it in the book and stuff, but I want to know what, aside from, world domination and things like that, I mean, what were the motivations of the Spanish to come on these ships across a massive ocean for months and months, all these things to come to some islands? Some of it maybe was economic, some of it was, exploratory, but what were their motivations? And second to that, why, I mean, how much of this is true with the Spanish? Maybe it's a little bit different with the British, I don't know, but of, you come to a new place, you see all these different people groups. Don't you want to try and work together with them? Don't you want to try and live next to them and cohabitate with them and learn from them in all these ways? But you talk about there's extreme colonial, horrific details, torture, mutilation, massacres, all of these horrible things up and down. This happens in Mexico, this happens in Central America, it happens in the Caribbean. And you say in Mexico, it's estimated, 15 to 30 million people lived in Mexico in 1519. And by 1600, only 2 million remained. I mean, that's devastating. I mean, why were the Spanish at this time, so horrifically mowing down all of these native peoples instead of trying to work together? Or did some people try to work together, but then it just they got out, voted? I mean, what was the dynamic here?
Well, I want to bracket that there was a humanist, universalist tradition in Spanish Catholicism that is a major focus of the book. But in terms of what motivated the Spanish colonial project, I mean, it was multiple vectors coming together. It was the consolidation of these kingdoms. I mean, Spanish Catholic, Isabella and Ferdinand, the king and queen of what was a recently united Spain, had just become victorious in a 7th century war of reconquest of the Spanish peninsula from Islam, driving Islam off of the Spanish peninsula. And in many ways, the conquest of the Americas is really just an extension. It's the next step. 1492 is when the last holdout, Granada, is abandoned by the Caliphate, and 1492 is obviously Columbus lands in Hispaniola. So the conquest of the New World is an extension of the reconquest of Iberia, which is a process of imperial consolidation, the creation of Spain out of warring fiefdoms and principalities, of merging royal absolutism, getting control over princelings and dukes and earls, and consolidating the power within the seat of Aragon and Castile. There's wars within, all of this is also taking place in the shadow of what were the Crusades, and and trying to retake Jerusalem from the Ottomans. The loss of Jerusalem and trade routes east was also another driver west to find ways to get to China, to find ways to get to India. There was also a process of capitalist expansion that was just really getting underway. The movement of sugar. Sugar was first planted by Europeans, believe it or not, in Gaza. Right after the First Crusade. That was the first kind of commercial sugar plantations that and then it moved west to Sicily, to Majorca, to the Canary Islands. By the time it gets to the Canary Islands, you start to see the slaves plantation systems that we come to recognize with transatlantic slavery, that then get transplanted to the Caribbean, to islands like Cuba and Hispaniola and Jamaica. So there's gold, there's a desire for gold, there's the desire for this kind of expansion of the Spanish realm, and then of course there's Catholicism. Catholicism is a religion with universal crusading pretensions. It understood itself as the world, and it fought a 7th century war against Islam. It had expelled Jews from Spain. It was before, aside from fighting Islam in Iberia, it was also fighting within the Mediterranean in the Crusades. Catholicism was a kind of, was an expansionist religion. And then, right at the same time in 1515, you have the You have Luther and the Protestant Reformation and the loss of Northern Europe. Mm-hmm. So you have Spain. You have Spain being endowed by the Vatican to represent its interests in the New World, especially at a time when they felt like Northern Europe was spinning out of Catholic control. So you have a lot of these very violent forces at work. Mm. And then, of course, you have what were the Native Americans? Were they human? And these debates, were they, these debates about barbarians go back to the Greeks and the Romans. Aristotle, among others, had an argument about a subspecies of humans who were natural slaves. They were inherently slaves. So many Spaniards applied that to the Native Americans to justify, the enslavement or the demands for tribute, demands for labor. The Spaniards arrived, as I said, that the process of colonialism was a process of labor mobilization, and as the population disappeared as a result of war and as a result of disease, African slavery then becomes the one of the, grows in importance in the Caribbean and the greater Caribbean circumference. But Native Americans are at the center of this whole debate because not everybody said they were natural slaves. Mm. Some people said they were human beings. Mm. And the argument of the book is that the Spanish conquest was such a horrific kind of it caused such a crisis within Catholicism. It was both, the discovery of a new world was both an affirmation of the expansive power of Catholicism, but then what we were doing to the people that were there was what, caused a crisis among some, among theologians. And there was an intense ongoing debate. It didn't stop the conquest. It didn't stop the slaughter. It didn't stop the slavery. But there was an ongoing debate within the councils of the royal court in Spain, in Aragon, in Castile, in Seville, about the nature of the people that Spanish conquistadors were slaughtering and enslaving. And there was a group of Spanish theologians, and I focus on one of them, Bartolomé de las Casas, but also more academic ones, Francisco Vitoria, that began to challenge pretty much everything about Spanish authority. The conquest was such a moral crisis that it called into account the validity. How could the Catholic Church claim to be universal if there existed half a world with more people in it than the rest of the world? How could what the Catholic Church claimed to be the bearer of humanity? Of all humanity, of humanitas, all the knowledge of the ancient world. And that knowledge turned out to be provincial, not universal. It turned out that there was a whole other half a world. So this debate, this crisis generated what I argue in the book is basically the beginnings of modern thought when it comes to ideas of human equality, when it comes to notions of national sovereignty. You have emerging out of the crisis the first arguments for abolition, not just abolition of chattel slavery from Africa, but emancipation of all peoples. You have notions of you have arguments questioning the right of Spain to claim dominion over the New World. By what right does it's clear that Native Americans reasoned. It's clear that they owned property. It's clear that they organized themselves in political communities, and hence they are equals. By what right does Spain claim to exercise dominion over them? These were all questions that there were no easy answers to, and the debates went on and on and on, and they were consequential. And again, it didn't stop. There's one early historian talked about these debates, but no good came to the Indian. It's true, no good came to the Indian. But the crisis itself was important for two reasons. One, it brings forth within Catholicism a current that's more humanist, that's more emancipatory, that's more humane.
Mm.
That remains in Latin America. Later on, it explodes with liberation theology, but also what happens later, and we could bracket this, is that when independence leaders in Spanish America break from Spain in the 1820s, they're well versed in all of these arguments against Spanish rule and Spanish sovereignty, and how the Spanish came like beasts and how they enslaved human beings. But they take those arguments and then they begin to apply them to the United States. And the United States drive west. And as the United States dispossesses Native Americans, as it takes a third of Mexico, as it pushes to the Pacific, as it takes Texas, as it expands slavery, the Latin American critique of U.S. conquest is very much an echo of the early Spanish critique of Spanish conquest. And so that's one of the themes and through lines of the book.
I do want to spend some time on that, because that to me was the meat and heart of the book of sorts, where I really enjoyed that kind of sorts conversation you're having in the book about that. I think it's very, very important. As you were mentioning about, motivations for them coming, how they saw, natives here in the New World, it reminds me of the book that Stefanos Geroulanos wrote, The Invention of Prehistory, where he talks about this idea, like how this idea came about of looking at humans and the people we don't know and the savage and things like that. And it's just very, very interesting history. We had a great conversation about that. So let's go to the British. That's what a lot of people here in the States know. And I mean, obviously I agree with you. In the New World, on the Western Hemisphere, the Spanish kind of a wrecking ball through much of what is today Latin America and southern U.S. But then we have the British that come, and there's something interesting there about, there was a really fascinating point that you made. I never knew this. So obviously, when the British come, they bring disease, disease ravages up in New England, things like that. It's pretty terrible there. You make the case in the book that there were some parallels between how the British controlled the Irish and how the Spanish controlled native peoples in the New World. So you can talk about the British here, but talk about that parallel, because I never, seen that parallel made, and it was very fascinating to me, these two kind of things here.
Yeah, I have a chapter called Irish Tactics, and because the British Protestant, Britain had already, Henry VIII had already, converted to Protestantism and broke with Catholicism, and then laid into Ireland. Conquest of Ireland was an ongoing process, but a good chunk of it paralleled the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Like you could, in the early 1500s and into the mid 1500s, and a lot of the tactics that the British used the British had a kind of ambivalent, this, and then this gets transferred into the New World, but an ambivalent relationship with Spain. Spain was both, the Black Legend, Spain was everything that Britain, everything bad to everything that was good in Britain, right? Where Spain was Catholic and superstitious and pre-modern and medieval and obscurantist. England was, the land of natural rights and liberty and scientific reasoning and thinking, and not warriors but farmers. The Black Legend was a way in which the English goodness was affirmed versus Spanish badness. But England's also compared themselves favorably because as they were emerging under Elizabeth into becoming an empire, Spain was the model. We wanted to be like Cortez, and so the conquest of Ireland was kind of read through the chronicles of the Spanish conquest. Like And so there's a lot of similarities between the two. And then, of course, many of the principles involved in the conquest of Ireland, which was brutal and included massacres, included forced starvation, and included weaponizing cannibalism, which then provided ideological justification for more brutality. A lot of those people were involved in the colonization of Jamestown. There was a kind of direct connection. And the interleaves of this is very complicated. So the Puritans published De las Casas was translated into English right away. His book, A Brief History of the New World, was very gruesome in its depiction of Spanish brutality, and so the English published it to amplify and broadcast and publicize Spanish atrocities. But then of course the British themselves did the same thing in when they went into the Chesapeake, and then when they went into New England. I mean, the big distinction though that I draw is when the Spanish arrive in the 1500s, they see the people. They see that De las Casas overestimated. He said there's more people in the New World than there is in the world. He was wrong about that, but Columbus called it a populated paradise. He described people living in organized communities, and this kind of dovetailed with Catholicism's universalism. Catholicism didn't deny that people existed in the New World, and Catholicism eventually incorporated that diversity into its universalism, which we can get to it later on. But that's one of the ideological foundations of social rights. The ability to reconcile universalism and difference, is kind of inherent in the Spanish colonial project. The British arrive in the wake of a plague that devastated New England, and they could imagine that they were landing in an empty land, an abandoned land, a land that had no people. And this becomes central to kind of British ideology of colonialism and private property. The idea that they didn't conquer New England, but they discovered it, that God brought the plague years before they arrived, because years before the settlers arrived, because European ships, Portuguese ships and Spanish ships and English ships had been sailing up and down the coast of North America and engaging with Native Americans and bringing European diseases in. But the idea that God brought the plague to clear the land for the saints, for the Puritans, and this idea that America was an empty house or an abandoned house, that was waiting for a new occupant. That the land belongs to those who occupy it, and the British landed, and there didn't seem to be anybody around, and maybe there were people around because there's houses and there were fields that were planted, but they were abandoned, and they understood that this was the result of a plague. This was a result of a massive epidemic, because the skeletons and the bones and the skulls were all around to be seen, and. But the idea that America was an uninhabited wasteland becomes kind of central within British notions of colonial property and settler colonialism. And that's an important distinction from Spanish colonialism. Spanish colonialism understands that they are conquering a mass of people, and they have to find ways to justify it. British colonialism could argue that they weren't conquering but were discovering, and hence they don't have to deal with difference. Difference is pushed to the frontier, right? So of course there were Pequods and there were Narragansetts, and there were many Native Americans who lived around Plymouth and what became Greater New England. but less and less so as a result of disease and as a result of sequential wars. So that's one of the points of comparison in the book.
Mm. Yeah, you explain it very nicely, and how, I mean, those things are those are very different frameworks. That's a very different way of conceptualizing, well, from our vantage point, conquest or excuse me, colonialism, but also even for the people at the time, there's a difference. I mean, both I think are pretty terrible, but it's terrible in different ways. And so, but what is, we'll get to it, is this kind of what begins to happen with both the United States and, the rest of Latin America in more modern periods of what starts to happen. Because of course we start to see the United States have their own misadventures with colonialism and imperialism, and what Latin America does, I would say, less of. I would say probably for sure. So okay, so we get to the American Revolution. I guess the one thing here before we get to Bolivar is what was the interaction? You talk about the Treaty of Paris that affirms Spain's possession of Florida, New Orleans, Mexico. This southern part of the current U.S. But then, what were the interactions between the U.S. and Spain? I mean, we did have a war with them, a short one, but we did have a war with them. Spain was sort of two minds, promoting slavery, but also supporting sanctuary in Spanish Mexico and parts of the U.S.
Yeah.
What was the interaction here between the U.S. and Spain, early 18th century throughout, or 19th century throughout?
Yeah, so Spain and France aid the rebels because they, so basically it was the Bourbon kings of France and Spain team up against the, George of London and Great Britain, and the support is indispensable. Spain provides an enormous amount of supplies to George Washington's troops. There's a battle in Nicaragua between Spanish and British forces, which denies British forces of Central American hardwood, which is necessary to repair ships. Spain is up and down the Mississippi River, so it's keeping the British occupied there, so they can't. The British can't kind of flank the rebels from the west. And Spain is really kind of, comes to the aid, and it immediately recognizes the enormous mistake that it made. It got into the war because the French king, the French Bourbon king, asked his cousin, the Spanish Bourbon king, to do it because France thought they'd be able to get some territory back that they lost in the 7-Year War. But Spain immediately realizes that the danger of the United States, that what has come into history is something that has never been before in history. Not just a republic, but a republic that Spain immediately understood to be expansionist, and it was, because a good part of the U.S. Revolution was wanting to get over the Appalachian Mountains. I mean, when, not to get too thick into the weeds, but one of the grievances of the Spanish colonials was that after the 7-Year War, London tried to kind of draw what they called a proclamation line along the crest of the Alleghenies and prevent white settlement into the Ohio Valley, into the Mississippi Valley. Well, it turns out a lot of the founders of the United States, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, among others, had already seized quite a bit of land in the Ohio Valley as speculators. And they wanted that land. They didn't want to be penned up east of the Alleghenies. So they immediately, I mean, even in the negotiations there's a Treaty of Paris in 1792, which basically ends the war. 1792 or 1782? 1782, I guess.
Easy, yeah.
What's that?
I think it's 82. I think that's right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, 1782. And it basically recognizes the United States Sometimes I wonder. Sometimes I fantasize that Trump is going to abrogate the Treaty of Paris and do the wrong one, like not the climate change one, but he's going to abrogate the 1781 Treaty of Paris, and the United States will no longer exist. Wouldn't that be great?
The funny and depressing part about it is that that's not too unrealistic. So.
But anyway, so there's the Treaty of Paris, and already. So France and Spain is trying to, use the Mississippi as a buffer to the United States and talk about the sovereignty of Native Americans. The negotiators, John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, is like, really, you're gonna lecture us about the sovereignty of Native Americans? Why don't you go look at the history of your conquest? And and so there's interesting ways in which these arguments about sovereignty kind of weave through history. But the point of the matter is that Spain was, after the Treaty of Paris was basically the western border of the United States, ran down the Mississippi, and it knew it had a problem. Mm-hmm. It knew that the United States wasn't going to stop at the Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And it came up with various strategies to try to contain the United States. And slavery existed in Spain, but Spain also began to promote sanctuary, began to tell any slave that managed to get across the Mississippi that they were no longer slaves. And this would continue on through after Spain gave way to Mexico. But Spain basically gets pushed back and back. It ceded Louisiana to France, thinking that it would use France as a buffer to the United States. Okay, we'll give you Louisiana, which is, of course, not just Louisiana. It's all this kind of trapezoid from New Orleans up to the northern Rocky Mountains, and Spain cedes that land to France, to Napoleon, thinking, okay, we'll let France deal with the United States. We'll kind of retreat back over here. And then 3 years later, Napoleon sells it to Thomas Jefferson, and Spain is once again pushed up against the United States, and they have to negotiate a new treaty, And so there's this constant sense that Spain is on the United States' side. Thomas Jefferson looked at Spain much the way the Europeans looked at the Ottoman Empire as an empire that was eventually going to collapse. And it's better that it collapsed slowly in pieces. And that's what Jefferson hoped would happen with Spain, that it would recede and collapse slowly, and the United States would pick up piece by piece, get Mexico, get Cuba, maybe Central America. Yep. It turns out Mexican rebels, Republican rebels, had a different idea, and they overthrew Spain and established the United States of Mexico on its own terms.
So while this is all going on up here in the north, we got a bunch of activity that really pushed and shaped. And so I'll give you a lot of runway here because, for people here in the United States, they know history of the U.S., but what's less known is this history in Latin America and specifically South America. So we have Simón Bolívar, who you talk about Miranda, who sort of a precursor to Bolívar, but they established the first Spanish America's first republic in Venezuela in 1811. Many people have talked about the U.S. Constitution as a document of restraint. And the Constitution down there was similar, but also different. You can talk about that. But we know Bolívar as the great liberator. 12 years, he creates Gran Colombia in 1819, and he brings indigenous peoples fighting against, the Spanish. Like, there's some similarities. Some people have said he's the George Washington of South America or whatever, but there's a lot of distinctive things too. There's a lot of things he did differently than we did up here in the United States. Maybe just you can kind of go where you want with this, but really talk about that story and really how it's different from what was happening with the United States up in the north.
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say what's at stake in all of this, and what I think is at stake in this. And you're right that the United States Constitution is a document of restraint in the sense that it limits the realms of activity that the state can intrude on, and it sets out a vision of individual liberty as great as possible, and it's a document that restrains the state. The state shall not, shall not, shall not.
Right.
It doesn't really have a positive vision of the common good. And one of the arguments of the book is that the intellectual and social history of Spanish colonialism compared with British colonialism and Spanish America compared with the United States emerges two different conceptions of democracy or two different conceptions of rights, where the United States is very much wedded to an individual rights conception of citizenship, in which the state, in which individual liberty is defined by the state staying out of people's business as much as possible, providing a realm of freedom, whether it be to assemble, to speak, to believe, the state shall not. In Spanish America, because of the Catholic intellectual heritage that we talked about, because of the social experience of Spanish colonialism, there emerged a much more social definition of citizenship and rights. In general, there's much more sociality in Latin America. Right? It's a culture that is rich with social life and being. There's a report from one U.S. diplomat in Caracas from the 1820s. He said, it seems like it takes the whole city to make the corn flour that feeds people for breakfast. And in New England, it would be like one person in one mill. There's a not just labor, but just there's a sociality in Latin America, and that manifests itself in a different conception of rights, in one in which it's not, the state doesn't restrain itself, but is actively promoting, has to take action to bring about. And by social rights, we mean the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to a pension, the right to join unions. This requires the right to land. This requires a much more activist state, a state that isn't just restrained, but is empowered. And this conception of social rights, which is more or less the general consensus of the world. Europe believes in social rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has a whole list of social rights along with political and individual rights. It's only the United States that really holds to this fetish of individual rights. I mean, when Bernie Sanders says we're the only country in the world that doesn't guarantee healthcare as a right, this is what he means. Yeah. I mean, he doesn't go on to explain what I'm saying, but a lot of this obsession with individual rights, I think, is the core of a lot of the schizophrenic politics of the United States. I think it's at the core of the conservative movement. And in Latin America, there is this, and you could go back to bring it back to the history. You go back to that constitution that you mentioned, the first constitution in Latin America. It was in Venezuela. It was written in 1811, 1812. And it was a short-lived republic that was eventually taken back by Spain. It failed, but and it had a whole palette of list of defined private property as sacrosanct, and it defined individual rights and the right to believe and the right and all of these individual rights. But it also included the word socials, a dozen times or so. I don't remember exact numbers, and it explicitly said that freedom is that true freedom isn't just like libertine excess. That freedom, individual freedom, has to be balanced against the needs of society. If not, you're no better than the wild beasts like those conquistadors that came. Though you want to see what that vision of freedom is, go look at the conquest of individuals completely unsheathed from any kind of restraints. So this conception that somehow the individual has to be balanced later by the greater social good eventually in the 20th century evolves into what we call social rights. And that's what's at stake in all of this. Now we could talk about Bolivar or any of the history you want to talk.
But what's the difference? Was that like Spanish influence? Was that something from because of all those years of conquest, they kind of metabolized some of that? Was that more indigenous influence? Like when they're creating that, were they looking to the north and be like, yeah, that doesn't seem to look good for us. Like let's do it differently here. Like where was that coming from?
It was coming from a lot of the stuff that we talked about a Catholic universalism, a Catholicism that understood itself as universal, but presided over an empire that recognized and administered difference. So there was a kind of already an acknowledgement that difference had to be kind of politically organized. And so whereas in North America, you didn't have to deal with, you just pushed it to the frontier. You didn't have to deal with social problems. You didn't have to, progress came by expanding the frontier, winning the West. Whereas in Latin America, progress came by, not distributing land stolen from Indians, but distributing land taken from wealthy landlords. But the Republicans, the independence leaders that led Spanish America's freedom movement, break from Spain, they liked the United States. They thought they wished they could have a civil society, but that was as dynamic as the United States. They didn't look at it and say we don't want that, but they understood that the social basis for that kind of liberalism didn't exist. After 4 centuries of Spanish rule, what you had was required an activist state to create virtue. You weren't going to create virtue just by letting individuals pursue their private interests. In the United States, that conceit, and it was a conceit because, a lot of people, virtue is relative, right? But you could believe that you would create public virtue by letting white men do whatever they, letting them loose, and especially this happens in the Jacksonian period. Nobody in Latin America, so you had these independence leaders, including Bolivar, inherited this whole tradition of an empire that claimed to be universal but recognized difference. And in order to try to transcend and overcome that empire, they recognized the need for as Alexander Hamilton put it, a government clothed in power. So that could control the rich and of course, the reality on the ground was tumultuous and chaotic and conflict ridden. But that did emerge within Latin America this more holistic vision of social citizenship that in the 20th century becomes full blown. Just to jump ahead, the Mexican Constitution of 1917 is the world's first social democratic constitution. Before Weimar, before India, that elaborates not just individual rights but social rights, and it says it's the state's obligation to provide healthcare, housing, education.
The basics.
That's what's at stake in this comparison.
No, it's because you can see everything kind of coming from that. So again, many things we could discuss. So I want to just pinpoint a few things here. So you talk about, I think it's become a bit discussed more recently. So there'll be some legs with this. every now and then the Monroe Doctrine comes up, and you talk about there's these 5 points that are made, right? First, the New World's off limits for future colonization by European powers. Second, the right to intervene throughout the hemisphere to protect its interest. Third, republicanism versus imperial monarchism. Fourth, the U.S. would recognize existing European possessions in the New World. And fifth, Mexico, Chile, Gran Colombia, and Argentina are to be free. There's a lot there, but there seemed to be this clear stance of imperialism from the new United States, which is interesting considering how the history goes. Concurrently, you talk about this, or very close after, this Panama Congress that happens, and there's this uti possidetis that says the legal conquest of in South America, which has some elements here, which is, they are mutual defense against Europeans, the manifesto condemning Spain, independence of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Canary Islands, Philippines, the Monroe Doctrine as international law, abolition of New World slavery, recognition of Haiti, and legalization of borders based on this in 1810. These are two big kind of concepts, and they're kind of close together. They're obviously really big, but just give us the snapshot of how these two things are important, and as you've been highlighting, how they have impact as we go through the 19th and then 20th century.
Yeah. So the Monroe Doctrine is issued in 1823. It's not really called the Monroe Doctrine until later, but it's a statement that's in James Monroe's State of the Union address, and it's recognizing the fact that Spain has lost the Americans. There's some states that are obviously independent, Mexico and Argentina, and announces that the United States is going to recognize those states. It also importantly says that the United States is not going to allow for the reconquest of Spanish America. Monroe Doctrine is an interesting document for the United States because it brings together a number of different ideological tendencies within the United States. It satisfies the internationalists who want the United States to be more engaged with the world. It satisfies, for lack of a better word, the isolationists or the unilateralists like John Quincy Adams, unilateralist who doesn't want the United States to be engaged with the world but wants the United States to be powerful. It satisfies people like Henry Clay, who imagines the New World as one great big emporium, and the United States is will be turned into New England, and Spanish America will be turned into the South. But the most important thing is this idea that the United States has the most important thing for Spanish Americans is that the United States has announced it will not allow for the reconquest of America, and Spanish Americans celebrated that. They thought that was a doctrine of anti-colonialism. Now, of course, we know that the Monroe Doctrine, as the years go on, turns into a kind of police warrant, a universal police warrant that allows the United States to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants in Latin America, because it claims the hemisphere, claims mandatory powers over the United States. But when it's first articulated in the State of the Union address, Spanish Americans read it as an analog to their own anti-colonialism. And now, what's at the foundation of that anti-colonialism of Spanish America? And here's the deal. So, in comparing the United States with Spanish America, the United States comes into the world alone on a vast continent that it basically then revitalizes the doctrine of conquest as it moves west. It justifies war on Mexico, war on Native Americans, the doctrine of conquest, the doctrine of discovery. It imagines the whole hemisphere as being, terra nullius, empty land, even though Spain claimed sovereignty, Mexico claimed sovereignty, there was indigenous sovereignty. But as it moved west, it asserted the right to take these lands through war and annexation. Spanish America came into the world already a United Nations, already a League of Nations. They had to figure out a way immediately how to live with each other. They needed a new doctrine of sovereignty, because each nation, each republic, both threatened and legitimated the other. It legitimated the other in the sense that, if one republic can rise up and overthrow colonialism, then another republic could do the same. And it legitimated the idea of republican sovereignty in the New World. But they threatened the other because of the doctrine of conquest was still vigilant. It still existed. So why couldn't Argentina do what the United States did and start marching on Chile to get to the Pacific? And so they couldn't. So they needed a new theory of sovereignty. And what they came up with, Bolivar and his foreign minister Pedro Gal came up. I mean, it was more roundabout and intricate way, but just to put it shortly, they came up with this idea of ute possidetis, which is an old Roman law doctrine that means as you possess, so shall you possess. It was used to say it was a doctrine of war in the past, and meant that if you seized land and at the end of the conflict, whatever land you had, that was yours. It's obviously relevant to the Ukraine and Russia, but what Bolivar and Gal did was they turned it into a doctrine of peace. They said look, we might not like Spanish colonialism, but Spain drew these lines, these administrative lines. They broke up the New World into these viceroyalties, and we have to take it as it is, And Argentina is Argentina, and Gran Colombia will correspond to what was the viceroyalty of New Granada, and Mexico will correspond to the viceroyalty of what was New Spain, and basically they basically said that these Now there were border conflicts between these new states because valuable resources existed on one side or the other, but through every conflict, Latin Americans reconciled and negotiated settlements by affirming the doctrine of ute possidetis, that and basically nullifying the doctrine of conquest, nullifying the idea that there was any land left in the New World that was available for conquest that was yet to be discovered. The Latin Americans said there was no more that all space was already socialized. There was no terra nullius. There was no more land that and we basically the world was and the United States was obviously different. The United States, United States' doctrine of sovereignty was effectively the doctrine of conquest. So the comparison between the United States and Latin America isn't just over individual rights and social rights, it's over these notions of sovereignty, in which one affirms the doctrine of conquest and its drive west, and one annuls the doctrine of conquest and effectively begins laying out the principles that would become the principles of international law, the prohibition of aggressive war, the idea that the international order should be organized around cooperative nations. Spanish America comes into the world, as I said already a United Nations, already a League of Nations. Some people think Europe that way, but Europe wasn't that. Europe was a bunch of metropoles, a bunch of empires that were skirting around the globe looking for new land to conquer, new plantations to found. Spanish America had no empires. They were nation states.
Right.
And it becomes the model for what becomes the League of Nations and what becomes the United Nations. And it becomes the affirmation of a rejection of the doctrine of conquest, the rejection of aggressive war, and wars of aggression. And of course, it's relative to the current moment because we're living,
of course,
at a moment where that is all being rolled back.
Yeah. So again, there's so much good history here. So I'm going to ask you two final questions to respect your time, of course. But it's an interesting thing because we do know the U.S. starts to become pretty imperialistic, right? And they, I'm thinking of, as you know, after the Civil War in the U.S., you really get to the era of William McKinley and how he's expansive, right at the turn of the century, from 19th to 20th century. And you mentioned Wilson in the book, which was really interesting. He's a he's controversial in many ways. He's definitely racist, but he also did some, really good policies as well, domestically, and so he's complicated. But you talk about his role. But I do want to ask about just, one question before the kind of final one is, you mentioned Secretary of State Hull, which was during Franklin Roosevelt's time, and how instrumental he was in the WPA and the TVA and the New Deal, but negotiating 15 trade treaties with many Latin American countries. I mean, much like when I was reading that part of the book, much of it's like we had this time between, maybe because of World War II and the Depression, things like that, out of, crisis, but we had this time between 1930, 32 or whatever, into 1945, or, you could maybe push that to 50, where we were on the precipice of doing what a lot of other places had done things, this kind of universal, rights. We were trying to, give, good working hours and good, unions, and we were trying to build all these things. And there's this block of time where a lot of that stuff, we still feel the effects of that, right?
Yeah,
Social Security, many, much of, what Johnson did domestically was just building off the New Deal. I mean,
yeah.
we feel so much of that. But so on this part, how much was Hull really, trying to push and expand in a helpful, kind of togetherness kind of way with the New Deal in Latin America? I didn't know that part of the story, so it was really interesting to hear how, yes, the New Deal worked in the U.S., but maybe it could work for the rest of the Americas too. Talk about that just briefly.
Yeah. The New Deal was definitely understood by many as a continental New Deal, but Hull's role in it was critical. I mean, Hull's an interesting character. He grew up in the Cumberland area of Tennessee. He was came from hill people. He was a backwoods country lawyer. He was a Jacksonian Democrat, but not one of those Jacksonian Democrats that looked with suspicion at the world. He was more of the moment where Jacksonian Democrats had become true domestic reformers. And he was named by FDR to be a Secretary of State. And what Hull did in 1933, FDR asked him to attend the Seventh Pan American Conference that was going to be held in Montevideo in Uruguay. And these conferences were held every couple of years, and every couple of years they were kind of the same thing. Latin Americans would demand that the United States give up the right of intervention, and, respect the right of sovereignty of all nations, big and small, in the internal and external affairs of the nations. And FDR, this was right at the beginning of the New Deal. This was 1933. FDR was in office just a couple of months. There were two conferences in Europe that both were disasters. That didn't result in any major reforms, monetary reforms or political reforms. It was clear militarism and political extremism was on the march, whether it be on the left or whether it be on the right, and Roosevelt sent Hull down to Montevideo, but he said, don't make any major concessions. Just, tell them we'll give them, lights so they can land their planes at night on runways, or we'll help them build a highway. But Hull went down, he sailed down, and he sailed down with the editor of The Nation, Ernest Gruning, who would later vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution as a senator from Alaska. And Gruning was an arch anti-imperialist. Particularly around Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and he said, listen, and he basically kept on telling Hull, like, listen, you've got to affirm the right of non-intervention. And then Hull said, how can I do that? When Roosevelt and I have to get reelected. He resisted it, but Hull was a free trader also. And he began to see that recognizing the right of non-intervention, or giving up the right of intervention, recognizing national sovereignty, could lay the foundation for a kind of renewed trade regime. And he unexpectedly, and against White House instructions, wholeheartedly in Montevideo accepted Latin America's demand to renounce the right of the U.S.'s right to intervene in the domestic and internal affairs of Latin American nations. And it was probably the single most effective foreign policy initiative that anyone in the United States had ever undertaken. It basically created the foundations it expanded the New Deal hemispherically. It allowed Hull to go back to Washington and begin these reciprocal trade treaties, which benefited what became the corporate base of the New Deal. The New Deal was in trouble during FDR's first term. And, the first New Deal was declared unconstitutional, a number of its initiatives by the Supreme Court. But Hull's, giving up the right of intervention and which created enormous goodwill in Latin America, also benefited what became the kind of corporate block of the New Deal, high tech, capital intensive, that didn't mind the expansion of democracy domestically. They didn't oppose the passing of the National Labor Relations Act. They didn't oppose what FDR was doing in terms of Social Security, like the more hidebound, sectors of the economy that required cheap labor. And in some ways, it saved the New Deal. And it became a kind of model for the post-World War War. It was enormously successful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great story. Of course, we could spend time talking about Colombia. We could talk about Guatemala. I know you've written about this in the 50s. Of course, there was the more misadventures by the Reagan administration in Central America in the 80s into the early 90s, etc. Obviously, liberation theology we mentioned. So we'll hand wave to all of that. And my final question, people should read the book and they can get all of that stuff, some really good stuff there in the more modern period. But my final question for you is how does an understanding of the Americas, very robust history, help us understand how the Americas can be more unified and united in the 21st century and really, as a kind of continued model for much of the world, as you've mentioned at different points?
Well, I mean, all history should be comparative. This comparison draws out what's important and what's distinct about anything that you want to study. And I think, a comparison with Latin America that's rooted in this long history that I did gives a sense of that what is unique about the United States isn't confined to the United States. American exceptionalism is, to really understand American exceptionalism, one has to understand it in the full sense of that word, America. The United States' unique sense of itself was forged in relationship to Latin America, and that there were different periods where what united the regions was something that one would actually want to deepen and develop. As you mentioned, some of the more solidaristic aspects of the New Deal, the support for the Mexican Revolution that Wilson partially did and FDR did, the support of social democrats in the run-up to World War II. Basically, FDR's support for the left in Latin America in the run-up to World War II helped defeat fascism globally. Latin America becomes a crucial kind of source of raw material during the war, but also Brazil becomes, that bulge out into the Atlantic becomes an important transport route. And Latin America could have gone either way. Latin America, a lot of strategic thinkers thought Latin America would basically fall into the kind of civil war between traditionalists and modernists that had overcome Spain. They looked at Latin America and they feared Spain writ large because Latin America was torn between the forces of reaction and the forces of progress. FDR sided with the forces of progress, who happened to be socialists or social democrats and communists. The alliance was with the left and against fascists. And the way that Latin America defeated fascism was by expanding the definition of democracy, as we talked about, to include social democracy. Yeah. You don't defeat fascism. This is the lesson that the United States can learn from Latin America, is that you don't defeat fascism by just obsessively talking about proceduralism or how bad the fascists are. You have to offer an alternative. You have to offer.
100% right.
You have to say citizenship includes the ability to live a dignified life, and the right to life also includes the right to healthcare, and that's how you defeat fascism, by offering an alternative, not just by obsessively talking about how bad the fascists are. and that's something we can learn from Latin America, and that's certainly pertinent for the present.
Of course, absolutely. Greg, I could talk to you for hours about this. I really, really enjoyed your book. It's one of my favorites this year, for sure. And this conversation was very, very illuminating. It was wonderful. I'm deeply appreciative for you coming on, giving us your time, your wisdom, your energy. And I highly recommend your book. So big thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a really great conversation. A lot of fun. Thank you.
Absolutely.